everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I wanted to talk a little bit about one of my favourite orchids, the Oncidopsis or Nelly Isler, which I wanted to do a bit of a care video on anyway, but I recently had a request from one of you guys, James, for a bit more of detailed information of how I care for them and kind of growing tips. So these guys are a little bit tricky. So I don't want to tell you in black and white terms how to care for them or grow them, because that kind of perfect method doesn't exist. It's just about adapting your kind of environmental conditions to try and match what the orchid requires. And if you can't do that, then there are a few little things that I do to kind of try and work around its requirements, which it can be quite a fussy orchid. So I just wanted to talk to you about how I care for these guys, a little bit of my history with them. So the Nelly Isler was the first of the kind of Oncidium types that I got, and completely oblivious to the fact that it's actually more heavily related to the Miltoniopsis than any Oncidium. It's intergeneric with a heavy amount of Miltoniopsis in its parentage. I think it's around 70% Miltoniopsis. I'll put the link down in the description to the orchid roots breakdown of its parentage, but it's got some Oncidium in there, which makes it, in theory, a little bit more of a vigorous grower than a straight Miltoniopsis. In practice, in my warm environment, I actually grow Miltoniopsis a lot better than I grow my Nelly Islers. I find Nelly Islers to be a little bit slower growing and a little bit more difficult to get established in a warmer environment. So the main first recommendation that I'd give is that when you purchase a Nelly Isler, try and purchase them in a cooler season. So if you live in a warmer climate, don't purchase them in the heat of summer and force them to adapt to your environment in the heat of summer, when actually that's going to be a real struggle for them, because they're going to have to adjust to a change in environment. Potentially, if you buy them from a garden centre, they might not have a good root system, and then you're asking them to put a new root system down and adapt and grow in conditions that are not ideal for them at all. They are, I wouldn't say cooler growing, but they like very high humidity conditions, heavily related to Miltoniopsis, which I've spoken about before, are cloud forest growers. They don't have adaptations that allow them to deal with low humidity and hot temperatures because they're not evolved to that environment. They've evolved to like a cloud forest environment where the relative humidity is probably like 90% most of the time, so they don't lose water through transpiration in the same way that they do when we come and take them and put them in like a hot home environment. So that's kind of the Miltoniopsis side of it. Now, in theory, these guys are more vigorous growers. In practice, what I find with them is that they're more vigorous bloomers. So every single new growth very early on with these guys, for me, puts out a flower spike or two flower spikes. Now, if they're not quite adapted to your environment and they put out flower spikes, they're diverting a lot of energy into flowering. So you kind of have to make that call as to whether you let it flower. Unfortunately, what they will tend to do, if you cut the flower spike off early, they will just produce another one from the other side of the pseudobulb. It seems like a waste of energy to let them mature a flower spike and then cut it off, but it might be what you have to do. It's kind of a judgment call. If the orchid is struggling, cut the flower spike. It drains a lot of energy from the orchid. So I grow these guys in my standard Oncidium setup, which I've shown you guys before, which is actually just the shelves behind where I'm filming here. So they're just grown on a shelf under LED under counter lights. They have a couple of extra lights put in there because I couldn't get enough of the under counter lights there, so they've just got some LED floodlights. They're not particularly bright, to be honest. They don't need really bright, heavy lighting in order to grow and flower well. They just kind of need standard Oncidium type lighting. And my Miltoniopsis are actually growing well and flowering under even lower lighting on the shelf below there. So it's not a really massive requirement. I certainly wouldn't put them into direct sunlight because it's going to stress the orchid, and the leaves are very prone to burning with these guys. They're very kind of thin, delicate leaves. So with these guys, I've got two in bloom at the moment, which are my standard Nelly Islers. This flower spike opened up a little bit later, so it is a darker, deeper red than the flower spikes that I had kind of blooming more when it was very hot in summer. And the flowers on these are very long lasting, very similar to Miltoniopsis. My Miltoniopsis are a bit more vigorous in my conditions. I can't really explain why that is, other than just the combination of genetics that made up the Nelly Isler has just unfortunately meant that in my conditions, the 3 I've got are much slower growing than the Miltoniopsis I have. Not necessarily harder to look after, they're just a bit slower growing, a bit slower to put out new growths and new roots. So I'm growing them in my orchid grow room, which is a converted spare bedroom. I don't have any like humidifiers or misting systems. I have like mini fans kind of going. You can probably see one at the top right corner of the screen there, like just a little mini USB fan directed on them just to increase the air movement. My humidity stays between kind of 60 and 70% usually, just because we're living near the coast. We have relatively high humidity anyway, and obviously I've got a lot of orchids in my grow room, so that kind of raises the humidity a little bit. Temperatures, I'd say mainly between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. In winter, I keep it above 18 degrees Celsius because I'm also growing hot growers like phalaenopsis and vandas in the same grow room, so I can't really let it drop down low in winter. In summer, this summer it went to about 35, 36 degrees Celsius in here. I'll pop those up in Fahrenheit on screen. So in a lot of literature, it would tell you that that's far too hot to be growing Miltoniopsis successfully, and therefore too hot to be growing the Nelly Isler successfully. In reality, you can absolutely grow them successfully in these conditions. You just maybe need to make a couple of adaptations. So one thing to be aware of, as I've discussed with you with Miltoniopsis before, and I'm sure you're kind of sick of hearing me talk about Miltoniopsis, but Miltoniopsis don't have the same mechanisms that they've evolved to prevent water loss through the leaves, so transpiration. Because they've evolved in a high relative humidity area, so cooler zones in the cloud forest with high humidity. So this means that they lose water through transpiration very easily. Now, with a lot of orchids, and this isn't certainly the case for all of them, and I found this isn't the case for things like masdevallias and rostrepias, but with a lot of orchids that are supposed to be cooler growers, I found that you can kind of get around it and grow them in a warmer environment if you provide enough moisture to the roots that balances the rate of moisture that they are losing through the leaves in that warmer and less humid environment, because the warmer, less humid environment is just going to mean that they're losing more water. So I keep all of my Miltoniopsis and my Nelly Islers in self-watering pots with a wick system and sphagnum moss. This one I repotted into this system in March. This was one of the later ones to go in. Got 2 new growths at the moment. It definitely did stall a bit. This is one of the most recent ones I've got. So this is the red velvet variety. The first ones I got were the Swiss Beauties, which have had a bit longer to adapt. But you can see since March, and I did put it into a much bigger pot than I should have really, we do have root growth. You can see that the roots are actually branching off there, and more root growth around there. More root growth there with lots of little branches, and we do actually have one, let's see, just here coming out of the bottom of the pot. So in that time it has developed a relatively extensive root system, but if you compare this to my Miltoniopsis, it certainly hasn't grown the root system at the same speed that my Miltoniopsis have. Obviously individual variability is a factor, but with having 3 Nelly Islers and considerably more Miltoniopsis, I've just noticed that they seem to grow that little bit slower. However, in general, try and keep them like a Miltoniopsis because they are quite fussy, and their requirements match really what the Miltoniopsis would require because it's a main factor in their parentage. So I've kind of discussed how I keep them. Something else that I haven't discussed is fertilizing. So I fertilize all of my orchids kind of the same at the moment really, because we've just been through summer. They've all been in very active growth, putting out new roots, new growths. This means that they are using a lot of nutrients, and so you can get away with providing more nutrients. You'd probably be horrified to know what I've been feeding my Miltoniopsis, which is probably around 300 parts per million. That's not necessarily what literature would tell you to feed them, but if they're using it, like my Miltoniopsis have been growing sort of 4 or 5 new growths each. They've really taken off this summer. I'll put a link to my Miltoniopsis summer update video in the top corner here, but they're using a lot of nutrients, so I've been feeding them a lot of nutrients, and that fact that they're using them means that they're not building up in the pot and burning roots. I would not recommend, if you're a beginner with Miltoniopsis or Nelly Islers or anything like that, to do that, because you have a massive danger of burning the roots. I just kind of wanted to mention it because this is how I'm growing them, but I wouldn't personally do it unless you're really confident with growing Miltoniopsis and Nelly Islers and that sort of thing, because it's quite a risky strategy feeding them high, because they do have very sensitive root systems. They've evolved into cloud forests, so that means that they're being fed with pure, very pure rainwater. They're not adapted to receiving huge amounts of fertilizer at the root zone all at once, so you need to be very careful with what you're feeding them. I would say lower is better, so during winter I probably feed them under 100 parts per million when they're not growing actively. I would probably stick with around 150 to 200 parts per million, 200 really maximum, until you're really confident with growing them and you kind of know how they're doing in your environment and you've got a feel for them. The way I get around growing them in a hotter environment is providing more moisture at the root zone in a self-watering system. That sort of system won't work for everyone. It's completely dependent on your environment. So what I would say is, if you're growing in a hotter environment, try and provide more moisture at the root zone. Don't let them fully dry out between waterings. Just let them kind of get to that evenly moist stage, and then just as they're starting to dry a little bit, if you're keeping them in organic media, water them again. Don't let them like completely dry out, because I think that's probably the main reason that they fail, when they just don't have enough water coming in compared to the amount of water that they're losing. Another reason would be loss of roots. So often when you get them, they won't have a great root system to start with, and they are quite difficult to recover. I found that putting them straight into sphagnum moss, there's little adaptation, because they're often in like a cocoa peat or quite cloggy mix. I've never actually received one in bark. So yeah, from nurseries they seem to come in quite heavy mixes, and there's little adaptation to sphagnum moss, whereas if you put them into bark, there would be an adaptation. The old roots might die off and you'd have to wait for new roots to grow. So yeah, that's kind of one thing I'd say to be quite cautious of, because they will be very slow to recover from root loss or lack of roots, just because they seem to be kind of slower growers in general. Now, once they have taken off and once they really get a good root system down, I would say that's not the case. Mine are now putting out kind of 2 new growths per orchid, and that'll kind of increase as they get more established. Like I said, this is the kind of newer one. Oop, just knocked the flowers there. That's kind of what I would say for growing the Nelly Isler. They're not difficult to rebloom. What they are difficult to do is to grow well and to grow sort of good specimen sized plants. I think that's the challenge. Getting to rebloom shouldn't be a problem. If you've kept them healthy, they will rebloom. So I think that that's kind of covered everything. So that's how I keep my Nelly Islers in my environmental conditions, which are growing sort of on the warmer side. I do have relatively high humidity compared to if you're growing in like Texas or some really, really hot environment. My humidity is going to be higher than that because I'm growing kind of near the coast of the UK. In response to that, I'm also growing very warm compared to what they supposedly should be grown as. Now, you know, this is all relative to your environment, so it's just up to you to kind of make an informed decision based on how you're growing. So I would try and do a bit of research and find how people are growing them in your local area if you're really struggling with them, because it could be that there's just an environmental factor in your area that means that you need to make a slight adaptation to how these are grown, as I have with growing in quite moist, and I am at the moment trying to find kind of inorganic alternatives to growing them in sphagnum moss. So I think at some point I'm going to trial them in Ceramis. It's a little bit scary to do so, but I think I'll probably start with the Miltoniopsis, because I seem to have more luck with the Miltoniopsis than the Nelly Islers. The Nellies are a little bit slower growing for me. And I think as well, the Nelly Islers tend to kind of exhaust themselves in terms of flowering. That could be another factor, because Miltoniopsis will mature a growth, and then when their growth's nearly mature, they will flower from it. Whereas Nelly Islers will put out a spike from an immature growth, no problem. Quite often I'll have 1 or 2 spikes coming out of very immature growths, and I'm like, just get some roots down for me, please, before you start flowering. So that could also be another factor, the fact that they're so floriferous. So that kind of genetic background is combating the Miltoniopsis side of it, so that could actually be quite a bad combination of genetics for the Nelly Isler. But they are very floriferous and they do grow well in the home once they're established, but it's just getting them established that can be a problem. So if you time it right with a cooler time of the year for when you get them, and make sure that you don't allow the plant to completely dry out. The reason for drying out in organic media is to allow airflow around the root zone and to allow the roots to respire. In certain situations, you can get away with not doing that. Like for example, I'm growing in sphagnum moss that retains moisture constantly because it's in a self-watering system. So I've got kind of pumice in there and perlite for air pockets. There's a bit of bark mixed in here as well. The roots are by no means suffocated. There are air pockets in there. So I hope that that video has been helpful about how I grow my Nelly Islers in a warmer climate with sort of medium humidity, and the things that I've kind of learnt about them and how I get around certain traits that they seem to have. If you've got any questions, then please do leave me a comment down below and I'll do my best to answer. I'm sure that there's things that I haven't covered in here that you guys maybe want an answer to, so just leave me a question and I will try and get back to you as soon as possible. And thanks so much for watching, guys. So if you enjoyed this video, then give it a like or subscribe to my channel for more regular updates, and keep an eye out for a Miltoniopsis video soon because Miltoniopsis season is starting, which I'm super excited about. I've got quite a lot of spikes coming on my Miltoniopsis, so we should get quite a show this year. And I will see you guys later. Bye!